So this is Earning Miles. I'm Casey Whitener. I'm with me, my good friend Jody Kane Smith.
Hi.
And this is episode 5 of our show here on YouTube. And we are Clemson Road Creative. We're based in South Carolina, but Jody works in Alabama. How's Alabama today?
Hot.
Yeah, it's hot
Like
here too.
melting things on the sidewalk hot.
Yeah, you'll have that. Summertime. So what we've been doing on Earning Mileage is talking about entrepreneurship, and we did 4 episodes all about different types of entrepreneurship. And this has been a fun summer for us as we were writing practical entrepreneurism to get ready for the fall school year, and have been just talking a lot about starting your own business. But now we're going to take a little bit of a right turn, and it's not that different from entrepreneurship. We're going to be talking about autonomy in this episode. So the title of the episode is Autonomy Rules. And I want to tell a quick story for where this word came into my life. I didn't think about autonomy that much, although I am a libertarian. I've always been a libertarian. So I did have this kind of sense of like, you can't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me. That's kind of been a little bit in my professional career for a while. But when I was at the Fortune 300 company that I worked for back in 2007, 2008 timeframe, and I was working on my PhD, I had a vice president call me into her office and ask me what my intentions were with the PhD. What did I want is specifically what she was saying. It was because I had asked for tuition reimbursement. Let's be honest. She wouldn't have cared about my graduate degree if I hadn't asked for tuition reimbursement, but I did. And she said, what is it that you want with this PhD? And I said, I want to do what I want. I want to work when I want, where I want, how I want. I want autonomy. And she said, well, you're not going to get that here. So fast forward several years later, finished the PhD, walk out the door there. They were right. They just did not have a career path for a PhD. They never did pay for my tuition. I'm still paying that off. But at this point now, I've been on my own since 2012. And 8 years into this entrepreneurial life, I do believe I have finally achieved full autonomy. And even though I'm teaching at the university, it's my choice every year whether I want to teach or not. And I get to choose my classes and I get to choose my schedule. And all of that is part of this autonomy concept. So at what point, Jody, did you get to a place in your career where you were like, I want autonomy, deuces?
Well,
And don't say
I,
today and then like
no,
walk off the set.
my husband and I have the level of autonomy I need, honestly. Like, I don't need any more freedom. Um, so my husband and I were at Fort Hood, Texas. I was working for the Department of the Army while he was still serving in active duty. And I worked for a certain department within MWR, which is Morale, Welfare, and Recreation. And for 3 years, I shot up the ladder very quickly, and but not far enough up the ladder. I wasn't far enough up that I could really affect change within family services and everything. So my chain of command, honestly, reached a point where it was intolerable. And it was so stressful for me to work in that environment any longer that when Jay and I then moved from Fort Hood, Texas to a base in South Carolina, I decided I absolutely have no interest in continuing my career with the DA. And so I just decided I was going to chuck it all and write a book. And
And become
like,
wildly famous and be on Oprah and get a movie made out of it, right?
yeah, that hasn't happened, but I did,
Yet.
write the book and got a publisher and all that great stuff. And now have another publisher and another book coming out. But I didn't really know what that writing career was going to look like. All I knew was that I was much happier when I was writing a column for the Savannah Morning News several years prior to this than I was making a whole lot of money working for the Department of the Army. I just, and I said, I have to do something in an environment that makes me feel comfortable in my own skin. And then once I got a taste for it, it was like, heck yeah, I really like this. Now let me figure out how to actually make some money.
Right. And once you get out and you never go back, right? And that's a lot of entrepreneurs, and I know that maybe they got laid off and so they started their own company, or maybe they did just get to the point where the company rules were just not going to work for them. Maybe they had small children, they wanted to stay home with their kids, or they have aging parents and they want to be home with their aging parents and care for them. For whatever reason, the 8 to 5 just does not work for them. And so they
Yeah.
end up going on their own, starting their own business. And a lot of times entrepreneurship is that freedom that they're looking for, but it can also be a tremendous amount of work. And we've talked about this frequently, where I think people underestimate when you become an entrepreneur, you have to do it all. You have to
Yeah.
be marketing, you have to be sales, you have to be IT, right? Like you are your own everything when you're out there by yourself. And so for a long time, it can be that there isn't going to be any income there. And so really, what do you have to be able to achieve autonomy? I would say a slush fund. I would say you need to have, you need to have a partner that can pay for your expenses, or
Yeah.
you need to, and that doesn't have to be a spouse necessarily, but I mean or a husband or wife, but it does need to be somebody that there's somebody here that's going to be able to cover, these kinds of basic needs that we have in our
Yeah.
home. And so I think that there's a luxury to being able to start your own business that people don't talk about very often.
Yeah.
And if you start your own business and you don't have that luxury of somebody else paying your bills, it's very difficult to get your business on track and stay focused and do exactly what you want your business to do, because you're going to do whatever you have to do to get paid.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about that in the Clemson Road Academy, where we're working with independent consultants who want to start their own practice. And we tell them, you've got to have a niche, you have to be really good at your niche, and you can't just do whatever anybody will pay you to do. But I see a lot of entrepreneurs that they're scrapping, and they have to, because they love the autonomy, but they don't have the slush fund.
Yeah. So at first, when I made this move, this drastic career change, first I had the hubs as my sugar daddy, so to speak. And I mean, I hate to admit that, but that was a luxury I had, that we didn't have kids at the time. So, all we needed to do was pay for the both of us, and we were fine with doing that. So that was great. But then the sugar daddy was medically retired, and that came suddenly, and it came the same year that the surprise baby showed up. And all of a sudden the financial outlook was a lot different, and I started looking for traditional jobs. And then you came along and said, hey, right for me. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. And it made up the difference between Jay's retirement and his active duty pay. But then, as all startups do, we went through some serious ups and downs as far as revenue streams and things like that. It's just part of the first 5 to 10 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so, during one of those down periods, I went back to a part-time job I had done 2 decades ago, which was visual merchandising, because I had to find a way to pay for the kid, who's now 5, to be in school.
Yeah.
And Alabama does not have free preschool. So, I go back to a department store doing visual merchandising, and realized very quickly that I was amongst very kind, nice people, but clock watchers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a clock watcher.
And we talked about that in a previous episode, where your second career in visual merchandising was what sort of drove you out of the 8 to 5
I mean,
altogether.
it was awful. Like watching the clock, like all of a sudden that mattered. Like
Yeah.
It matters that I wander around this store and make things look pretty for 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, so I can make my part-time hours. That's not work. And it's not work for people who really want to create something, especially something of their own, which I think that's a huge part of autonomy. I don't want to be autonomous because I don't like people, or I don't want to be around people, or I want people to leave me alone. I want to be autonomous because I want to be the one creating something. I don't want to be checking boxes for someone else's creation.
Well, you have value to add, and not just like Jody has value to add to Clemson Road, but I mean, an individual contributor has specific value in an organization. And I think it's about time that our management takes a look at that and says, what are our individual contributors actually contributing? And then start managing the contributions,
Yeah.
stop managing the people. People are individuals. They're going to do what they want to do. They're going to dress the way they want to dress. They're going to show up when they want to show up. You know, they're people are people. And again, as a libertarian, like I love them all. Like by all means, be free to be you. Let your freak flag fly. I'm all over that. So as a manager, then if I'm not going to manage the people, what I need to be managing is the results and the
Yeah.
outcomes that those people are giving me. Let's manage the product. Let's manage, what we're trying to accomplish and the process that we're going to follow to accomplish that.
Yeah.
So stop trying to manage individuals, right? Let them be themselves, but then think about how can those individuals contribute to what the company is trying to do. And this is a big pivot in management. I mean, this is one of the guys that I was explaining. You and I have this program called the Knowledge Alternative Work Models. And when I first explained it to Ray Kelly at the Darla Moore School, continuing education, which is they do executive education, they teach companies. And I start telling it to him and he goes, I don't think you understand what a revolution this is to talk to managers about looking at the product that their people are building. Like, what are you building for me? And how is that thing you built, that product of your work, contributing to what we're trying to accomplish here? More than anything, I think managers get to that place when they're willing to trust that their employees will actually do the work. I believe that you can do the things I've asked you to do. I believe you're going to contribute to the project. And because I believe that about you, I'm not going to stand next to you and go, you're 15 minutes late.
Yeah.
Right? I don't care that you're 15 minutes late. I don't care that you're at the movies on a Tuesday afternoon because I trust you to meet deadlines and to deliver the product when it's time.
Yeah.
And I think that's that is the gift, right? The manager that has that gift that says, I trust you. Here you go.
Yeah. Kind of work environment change that we're going to have to kind of bump through,
Mm-hmm.
because I know there have been many times in my career where I questioned the trust that my chain of command had in me. And whenever that trust was questioned, I feel that innovation really suffered.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, it was kind of the first indicator that I'm not in the right place.
Right.
I need to move on. And this happened in several, different locations as I moved around and kept changing jobs and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's a big responsibility of the manager to try to kind of heal those wounds that
Mm-hmm.
any employee, unless you're like fresh out of college, that person is going to have some of that scar tissue of
Yeah.
not being trusted. And they're not going to believe at first that autonomy can actually exist hand in hand with innovation and progress. And then I think the next thing for a manager also to look at is stop white knuckling onto your old processes.
Yeah.
Like, like loosen up the grip a little. And if you're, as your employees start to trust that you actually trust them, I think that's when innovation happens. That's when employees start really investing their kind of heart and soul into their work. And
Right.
it's not just clock watching. So they're going to come to you with good ideas and new ideas and maybe even horrible ideas. A manager owes it to their employees to say, well, let me think about that. Let me
Yeah.
consider that.
Well, or hey, let's give it a chance. And here's how we're going to know it's successful. And here's how we're going to know it failed, right? Like, let's run a little control environment here. And I think as entrepreneurs, we do that all the time, right? And so our business owners are going to know this because they started something from scratch. They tried something, it didn't work. They backed up. They tried a different direction. That didn't work. They backed up. They have a lot more patience for that process. But in a big corporation, if you've come in as a sales rep and you were made sales supervisor, and then you were made sales manager, and then you were made sales director, the patience with that process is a lot shorter. And the
Yeah.
trust that your employees are going to be able to do the work you need them to do without following these proven techniques is, it's kind of low. And so when we start talking to individual managers about how do you adopt a more autonomous work environment, a results-oriented work environment, it really does become about what does the company need for these employees to do. I don't need for them to show up at 8 o'clock every day and sit in their chair until 5 p.m. What I need for them to do is make a certain number of outbound calls to qualified leads and have constructive conversations that are going to help us get closer to a sale. How
Yeah.
do I measure their results? I measure their results by the number of phone calls they make, by the number of contact that they've had. And now that Charlie, my husband's in a outside sales rep job, and one of the things that he and I have been talking a lot about since he got this job, when he left the retail environment where he was working for 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours a day, clock in, clock out, versus now where it's all about results. This is what I've been able to do. This is the number of calls I made. These are the numbers. And okay, well, if you've made this number of calls and had this amount of sales, if you double the number of calls, will you also double the number of sales? And those kinds of metrics, I think, are where our managers can really shine because they're really good at that. And they don't have to be clock watchers. But I think we default in a physical environment. And this is where we're, I think, going to talk about moving into like what's happening now, right? In a physical environment, it's so easy to be able to manage that way. They walk in the door, they're wearing ripped jeans and a pair of ripped shoes. Clearly you're not cutting the mustard here today, right? Like you don't look the way you're supposed to look to be in the office. But now that people have gone home, we don't have those superficial measurements anymore. We don't have the log-in time and the log-out time. We don't have superficial measurements. So we really do, as people go home, have to be creative about what do we think it takes to get the job done? And then is the person doing those things?
And I don't even think that it's a question of creativity. I think it's a question of logic. I can't walk through all the cubicles as a manager and make sure that nobody's on Amazon or whatever.
Right.
Instead, I have to look at what my employees are reporting to me and validating those reports and making sure that the actual business of work is being done. And I think that's much more logical than the cubicle cities of, oh, good, I'll see as soon as her head starts bouncing down the cubicle aisle, that's when I'll flip back over to this document that I'm supposed to be editing.
But admit that it's also harder, right? If you're a first-time manager and you don't know how to approach people who aren't doing quality work, it's harder to look at them and say like, hey, your work's not very good, right? As opposed to being like, you're leaving early again. You know what I mean? There's a way in the book that you and I talked about, why work sucks and what we can do about it. They call it sludge. And they say it's this sort of fake way of creating a culture that says work is showing up on time, not leaving early, sacrificing your family for your work. And it's the sludge that people throw around is how they mock one another for not doing the work and for not being there, right? But it's the reason they call it sludge is because it's not of any value at all. It doesn't actually build a quality culture. What it does is allow people to heap the blame on others. Well, we would have done that, but Joe didn't show up to our meeting, so we couldn't do anything. You couldn't do your work because somebody else didn't do their work. Okay, let's follow the logic there and see how true that really is, right? And so I think it is harder to be a manager when you have to manage to expectations, when you have to manage to results, as opposed to managing by walking around.
Yeah. I think that is why I am a big believer in detailed job standards or position standards. And when I say detailed, you have to get rid of all of that human resource kind of nonsense language of, other duties as described and all of that. You have to get rid of that. And so if I was to write a job description for myself, there would be specific language in there about, the handing in drafts free of typos, grammatical errors, things like that. There would be specific language about turnover time as far as writing assignments attendance. There would be a quality control as far as, does the content that you're submitting meet our marketing needs, things like that. Because then, and the reason I am a big believer in this is back at Fort Hood, where I was managing a staff of 12 fabulous women, but they were all they were extroverts, they were headstrong. I loved each of them dearly. I really did. I loved my staff. I adored them. But there was a part of me that was kind of terrified of them. And it was because they had mostly been around for longer than I had. I was the newbie in the room, and I was walking into these big personalities and everything. And so I leaned on those job descriptions and those standards when it came to any kind of job counseling.
Yeah.
Because then it wasn't you showed up late twice. I could look, and I had a tangible, you're entering information, personal information, incorrectly. And I could look at that job standard and point to that. That was much easier to do than me having to look at them and go, look, you're not being as accurate as I need you to be, because I'm not a confrontational person. I don't do that well. It makes me break out in hives.
But no, so I think you make a good point about this, because when you have the specifics around the performance that you're expecting from somebody, and we break this into results and responsiveness and revenue, and we get very specific about what each individual contributor is supposed to be doing in each of those categories. And when you get very specific about that, you're basically creating for your employee a rubric that says, if I'm meeting expectations here, I'm doing the job I was hired to do. And I think as we watch some of my students graduate out of business school and into the workforce, those managers are going to be expected to have that kind of rubric. They're going to be expected to have said, before the person ever gets hired or before they ever take that job, this is exactly what's going to be expected of you. And I think for too long, we've been depending on the sort of, like I said, the superficial expectations. You're going to dress in, your business casual, and you're going to be here 5 days a week, and you're going to put your 40 hours in and whatever. And I don't think that that is an accurate way to clock remote workers. And by clock, I mean measure, right? Like not actual time, but how do you measure remote workers, and how do you measure the results that they're producing for you? And I certainly think you need a rubric for that. You have to have some way of explaining to them what's expected of them.
Hourly employee who their job is to sit and wait for customer service phone calls, wait in a chat room for that next person that they're supposed to assist with whatever techie problem they're having. With the exception of that, we do not need to look at remote employees and say, well, your salary is $40,000 a year. And because it's that, and we're supposed to work 40 hours a week and blah, blah, blah. And no,
and to that point too, a lot of times
the create part of a business, the thought, the leadership part of a business, you aren't working hourly. Your brain is probably in some way working all the time.
Well, and to that point too, it's harder. That knowledge work that we're asking people to do, the analysis work, the creative work, that knowledge work that we're asking people to do is harder than the clerical work, right? And because it's harder, to expect them to be able to do it for 8 hours a day is crazy. I mean, it's exhausting to do that kind of work for 8 hours a day. They would not last if they were thinking like that. Not to mention, they're probably not biologically disposed to that. And people think at different times of the day. They are more responsive in the morning, or they're more responsive in the afternoon, or they do their best work in the middle of the night. If you have remote employees, why are you working 8 to 5? Ain't nobody coming in your door. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need office hours. Like, they can work whenever they need to work. You just have to trust that they're going to do the work.
Yeah.
And give them, it's about autonomy.
Yeah. Set up communication expectations as far as that's where our responsiveness comes in. Are you being responsive to deadlines? Are you responsive for information? Things like that. If you have those established in your remote work plan before work ever begins for an employee, I think it's going to go a lot better. And the reason I say that is because when you hired me, that was my first like real, oh, now I'm remote working for someone else. This is way back when, years ago. And I was like, okay, how is this going to work? And you laid out the communications plan. You laid out what the responsiveness expectations were. And went ahead and told me, hey, and on Mondays, we're going to have a check-in. Other than that, Jody, I don't care when you do your work. You just better respond to me in the appropriate time frame allowed whenever I send stuff. And then because you had a plan and that plan was delivered in a very direct way.
Early.
It wasn't well, this is what I prefer. And I hate that. Like remote work does not have any place for passive aggressive people.
Right.
Can't be.
No. Yeah, you're exactly right about that too. There's no time for that. And especially if we're communicating in a written way, like we use the Slack channel, we use text messages, we use email, there can be no ambiguity in the language that you use to communicate with your employees. That's 100% true. So I think we talked about autonomy. I think we kind of did our like a transition here from entrepreneurship to the remote work environment. And I do believe that this concept of remote work is going to just kind of run away with us over the next, at least the next year, as we're still battling globally this pandemic and still watching companies try to come to grips with what does it look like to be apart from one another and to still be able to do our work. And I think we have the tools. We're just not necessarily equipped to change our lifestyles to support it. And more than anything, I know a lot of people are working from home. They're maybe a little frustrated that their kids are around, their spouses are around, right? Like there's a little interruption. It's not quite the same, right? But when we take away the industrial framework that says it's 8 to 5 and you have to sit in your chair and I am managing by walking around, and instead we look at autonomy and we say you've got all the time that you need to get the results, as long as you're being responsive and you're contributing to our revenue. I'm pleased with your performance. I think that's a very different approach to management. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that moving forward. At least I hope so. Anything else to add as we're closing up on this particular episode?
No, just live free or die. I'm kidding.
as the little porcupine goes walking across. All right. So, yeah. All right. Well, that's it. Then that's episode 5 here on Earning Miles. Thank you for being part of this. This is Clemson Road Creative. You can get more information at clemsonroad.com. We've also got show notes down below the video there, so you can subscribe to this channel and learn more about what Jody and I can do for you. If your company is considering moving to remote work and you're looking for a results-oriented model that will help you manage the outcomes that you're looking for instead of worrying about managing your people, by all means, get in touch with us. We'll be glad to help you out with that. Thanks, Jody. Bye, Jody.